Please subscribe, like, and share. It really helps us out. And of course, if you have any questions, comment below and we will answer you as soon as we can. Welcome to another video in our series on IGCSE History. In today's lesson, we will be looking at the Cold War, between 1972 to 1991. If you haven't seen our previous videos, click on the card above.
Today we'll be looking at the Cold War between 1972 to 1991. The world experienced a bumpy ride in the final years of the Cold War, with post-Vietnam détente, the Star Wars rhetoric of the USA, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the collapse of communism. During this period, there were attempts to reduce tension between East and West. After the scare of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then the humiliation of the Vietnam War, the 1970s saw the USA, the USSR, and China making an effort to improve relations. This led to a period known as détente, a word meaning the relaxing of tension. So, what evidence was there that tensions between East and West were easing in the 1970s? Firstly, the arms race was expensive. Sides began to realize that money for nuclear weapons would be better spent on improving living conditions at home. Secondly, the new US President, Richard Nixon, knew the war in Vietnam needed to be brought to an end. The USA would eventually leave Vietnam in 1974. Next, the relationship between the USSR and China, the world's most important communist nations, had soured. This was known as the Sino-Soviet split. For the USA, it meant it was easier to establish diplomatic relations with China. Nixon made a symbolically important visit to China in 1972, which showed that he was trying to improve relations with the communist superpower, and subsequently the US dropped its objections to China joining the United Nations. Nixon hoped that the Chinese would help push the North Vietnamese to a resolution in Vietnam. Furthermore, in 1972, SALT I, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, was signed by Nixon and the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The agreement restricted to the number of ICBMs both sides could have, but was criticized by some for not limiting the production of new nuclear weapons. Also, in 1975, American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts met and symbolically shook hands in space. Finally, in 1975, the Helsinki Agreement was signed by 35 countries, including the USA and the USSR. These countries were signing up to recognize the European borders established after World War II, as well as some basic human rights such as freedom of speech. This effectively meant that the Western Allies recognized Soviet control over Eastern Europe. It also meant that after decades of communist dictatorship, the Soviet Union had signed up to a basic human rights agreement. So, where did it all go wrong? In 1977, a new US President, Jimmy Carter, entered the White House. Carter was a Democrat and had a different view of the USA's foreign relations and place in the world, and he criticized the USSR for its human rights abuses. Secondly, between 1977 and 1979, the USSR began to replace its out-of-date nuclear missiles in Eastern Europe with SS-20 missiles. These were a new type of battlefield nuclear weapon, leading many in the West to believe that the Soviets had not abandoned the idea of nuclear war or expansionism in Europe. The USA responded by developing cruise missiles and deploying its own battlefield nuclear weapons to Europe. Finally, with the arms race apparently on again, and then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the US Congress refused to ratify SALT II, a second agreement of strategic arm limitation talks, because it, as far as they could see, the USSR had broken its commitment to limiting the creation of new nuclear weapons. At this point, we need to talk about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. In addition to the development of new nuclear missiles, the Cold War escalated further when the USSR invaded Afghanistan. But of course, the first question is, why did the USSR invade Afghanistan? Afghanistan bordered some of the southern Soviet republics of the USSR, making it easy for Moscow to support a communist-led government led by Tariki when it seized power in Kabul in April 1978. Many ordinary Afghans rejected the new communist government because its atheism was at odds with their Muslim faith. The communists imprisoned, tortured, and murdered many Muslim religious leaders. This led to the formation of an anti-communist resistance movement known as the Mujahideen. In September 1979, the Afghan politician Armin arranged for the murder of the communist Prime Minister Tariki, and Armin seized control. Armin entered into discussions with the US. This alarmed the USSR, who didn't want American influence on their southern border. On the 24th of December 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan. Armin was assassinated and a pro-Moscow leader, Babrak Karmal, was installed in his place. So what were the challenges faced by the Soviet army in Afghanistan? Firstly, the Soviet army was ill prepared for the desert and mountain landscapes of Afghanistan. Secondly, the Mujahideen had expert local knowledge and used the deserts and mountainous terrain to their advantage. And lastly, the Mujahideen were extremely motivated, as they were fighting for their homeland and their religion against a foreign invader. So what was the American response? Firstly, seeing the situation in Afghanistan as an extension of the Cold War, the US supported the Mujahideen against their old enemy, the USSR, and refused to sign SALT II. Secondly, the Carter Doctrine. Believing that the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan might lead to threats to US interests in the Persian Gulf, in January 1980, the US President Jimmy Carter announced in his State of the Union address that the US was extending its policy of containment to the Middle East. The Carter Doctrine stated that the US was prepared to use force to stop any country from gaining control over the oil-rich states of the Middle East. Alongside this, Carter formed an alliance with China and Israel to support the Mujahideen rebels against the USSR, and the CIA secretly provided the Mujahideen with weapons and funds. The USA also imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union and abolished most US-Soviet trade, which led to a deterioration in diplomatic relations between the superpowers. Lastly, in 1980, the USA boycotted the Moscow Olympics in protest at the invasion of Afghanistan. the USSR would return the favour by boycotting the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. Afghanistan became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, an expensive, embarrassing war with little hope of victory, where they were beaten by local guerrilla forces. It dragged on until 1988, when the Soviet leader, who by then was Mikhail Gorbachev, signed a deal to end the war, and the last Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February 1989. The last years of the Cold War were overseen by two very different leaders: Ronald Reagan, an ex-Hollywood actor, and Mikhail Gorbachev, a Ukrainian Russian from a peasant farming background with a law degree from Moscow State University. We're now going to look at the influence of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. His matching number in Moscow was still the ailing Brezhnev. Reagan was a committed Republican and anti-communist who, in a speech to the National Association of Evangelicals, referred to the Soviet Union as that evil empire. Reagan increased US defense spending by $32.6 billion and planned to spend it on, firstly, the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, nicknamed Star Wars after the popular film. It was a plan to create a system using satellites and lasers to shoot down any missiles that might be launched by the USSR against the USA. This plan, had it been initiated, would have swung the nuclear balance strongly in the USA's favour. The US military developed a neutron bomb. The Soviet Union described the neutron bomb as a capitalist weapon because it was designed to destroy people while leaving their property intact. While the USSR did not have a neutron bomb of its own, it did upgrade the armour of its tanks and armoured personnel carriers in order to deal with the threat. The Soviet Union's economy was struggling, and the cost of matching such a program was too high. They were also very suspicious of the computer technology that was required to support such a program, and had not invested in it. SDI was the final straw breaker. The USSR could no longer afford to keep up with the Americans in the arm race. Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the USSR in 1985. Under his leadership, the USSR slowly began to reform. Gorbachev was an unexpected new leader and relatively inexperienced. He did not speak kindly of Reagan at first, calling him a caveman. However, several things were about to have a major impact on the superpowers' relationship. Gorbachev famously got on with other world leaders. Margaret Thatcher said, "I like Mr. Gorbachev, we can do business together." Thatcher and Reagan already had a very good friendship, and the personal relationship between the three leaders made it easier for the superpowers to maintain diplomatic talks. There was an enthusiastic reaction to Gorbachev's arrival in many Western countries, which was called Gorbimania by the press. In April 1986, the Ukrainian nuclear power plant at Chernobyl went into meltdown and exploded. Gorbachev approved a cover-up that denied there had been a radiation leak, but it was clear to Western powers that there had been. The cost of containing and decontaminating the area was an estimated 18 million rubles and almost bankrupted the USSR. Chernobyl was a powerful symbol of the problems in communism. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika a freer economy including competition and incentives to produce goods, kicked off the slow reform of the Soviet Union's political system. Realizing the USSR could never outspend the USA, Gorbachev began to cut spending on nuclear weapons. He initiated the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, or START, with the USA, and in 1987 signed a deal to limit the production of intermediate-range nuclear missiles. So what were the impacts of Gorbachev's reforms in Eastern Europe? The increased freedoms and openness in the USSR during the Gorbachev years encouraged similar changes across Eastern Europe throughout 1989. Firstly, Hungary. Following years of disillusionment with communism, things began to change in Hungary. János Kádár was replaced as the leader of the Communist Party, and there were discussions with other political parties in roundtable democratic talks. Hungarians began to dismantle the barbed wire barriers along the borders with Austria. The Communist Party renamed itself the Socialist Party in October 1989, and democratic elections took place the next year. Next, Poland. After years of protests against communism, led by the Solidarity trade unions, free elections in Poland in June 1989 brought the Solidarity leader, Lech Walesa, to power. Next, German Democratic Republic. East Germans had observed the events in neighbouring Eastern Bloc countries with great interest. People started to protest against the hardline government of Erich Honecker. Honecker ordered troops to fire on demonstrators, but the troops refused to shoot at their compatriots. Gorbachev refused to send Soviet troops to shore up Honecker's regime. The reforms in Hungary meant that many East Germans were making their way to Hungary, and from there to West Germany. The East German authorities were forced to allow people to travel more freely in order to cope with the flow of migrants, and eventually, on the 9th of November 1989, East Germans were told that they could cross the border into West Berlin. In dramatic scenes, the Berlin Wall was torn down by demonstrators. Germany was reunited in 1990. The fall of the wall was massively symbolic of the end of the Cold War. As one Berliner sprayed painted on the wall, "Only today is the war really over." The fall of the wall speeded up the pace of change across Eastern Europe. Now we look at Czechoslovakia. There were anti-communist demonstrations in Czechoslovakia in 1989, and it opened its borders with the West. The playwright, Václav Havel, was democratically elected president in 1990. Next, Romania. At the end of 1989, a short, bloody revolution overthrew the communist leader of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, who, together with his wife, was executed on Christmas Day. Other Soviet republics. In 1990 and 1991, one by one, the former Soviet republics of the USSR, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, declared themselves independent. In August 1991, some hardline communists attempted to stage a military coup in Moscow, arresting Gorbachev and holding him under house arrest at his dacha in the Crimea. There was huge popular opposition to the coup, which collapsed, and Gorbachev was released. This was the coup de grace for the USSR, and by the end of 1991 it had been dissolved. Russia declared itself a republic in 1991 and elected Boris Yeltsin as its leader. There is often surprise at the way that the Cold War ended. It had been so dramatic. It seemed unlikely that it would fade away in such an undramatic way. But try not to overthink it. The USSR had not been able to keep up with the USA for many years, and Gorbachev's attitude and commitment to developing a mutual understanding had paved the way for the breakup of the Soviet bloc.
Thank you for watching our video. Please like, subscribe and share. And comment below so we can clarify things for you.